Hello everyone, welcome back to CEDH Northwest. You're gonna have to apologize the delay in the videos and maybe some audio stuff that's going on here. I just moved, so there's new setup stuff that I'm still figuring out. Pardon if there's a bit of an echo or something. But today we're gonna be doing Enter the Battlefield episode 3. We're gonna be talking about Windows. But before we get started in that, just one thing I wanna share, make sure everyone's aware of, is the quest. We talked about this event before. It's to help fight children's cancer. It's from the Tap for Hope organization. This is happening on May 15th and 17th, or May 15th through 17th, rather. We got more information right here. So it's gonna be a really large CEDH tournament. It's gonna be a massive prize pool. Probably the biggest event that the Northwest region of the U.S. has ever seen. And once again, it's all for charity. So make sure that you register for this if you haven't yet. There's going to be a bunch of people there. There's going to be events and all sorts of people to meet. We're going to have on-demand bronze events starting on Friday. And then, of course, the main event's going to be Saturday, Sunday. And then people are going to be hanging out, doing LobbyCon, jamming games, talking to people. There will be a charity auction and whatnot as well. And there will be a fair number of content creators there as well. So you can look for like comedian, you can look for Gold Sabertooth. I believe that Critical EDH is going to be there. And then, of course, the Northwest's very own Tag C. That's a good card. Podcast will be there as well. And they're going to be facilitating the auction portion of the event. So make sure you've signed up. The QR code's right here. And there is going to be a link in the description so that if you have not signed up, because it's starting to fill up quickly, you can. So now back to our topic of the day today. We have Windows. Now, Windows are going to be probably one of the most important things that players need to familiarize themselves with around the concept as they try to get better at CEDH. And the more you improve, the more you'll understand sort of how these windows work, when and where they present themselves, especially for different strategies, and how you can force them and take advantage of them in various ways. But before we get started and delve a little bit deeper into the topic at hand, we're going to start by breaking down precisely what is a window and the different types of windows. So what I have in my slide here is that the window, as we call it, and you'll hear this term a lot, is, oh, I missed my window, or this is my window, or I'm not going to get a window. My window is closed. These things happen. We say this word, these phrases a lot in CEDH when we're talking about sort of the terminology of the opportunity to win the game. This is just a broad term for any time a player can attempt to present something. Sometimes you'll hear people around the political phrase of, this isn't your window, or the window's not open, or something like that. So to sort of dissuade other players from making an attempt to try and win. Sort of using that sort of technical terminology to send the idea across that, and we talked about this communication style, right? So when in the previous episode, when we were talking about politics, we were talking about communication models, we were talking about how if I'm saying one thing and you're hearing something else, doesn't really matter what I'm intending, right? But when we have technical terminology here that people are broadly familiar with, it's a lot easier to communicate concisely and accurately what my intent, and then get it to you as my intent, right? So you understand what my intent is, and my intent is coming across as what you understand, right? So if we all know what a window is, that makes that sort of communication better. So for this, a window is, like I said, the opportunity to try and win the game. Now, there are a couple different ways that players can sort of seize upon the opportunity to win the game. And this is broken down right here. Winning under, after, through, or in spite of. This is basically just under means you're the first person to put a win on the stack. You're going to win under other decks' abilities to stop you or present their own win. So faster than, right? Winning after is going to be winning second. So if the first player pushes their win, they're trying to win under, they get stopped. They didn't successfully win under. And so now the person who's right after them in turn order untaps, and they get to put their Thassa's Oracle or whatever on the stack, and the only counterspell at the table is spent. Therefore, player 2 wins instead of player 1, right? So that's winning second, winning after. You won after somebody else's win attempt. Then there is winning through, which just means that you're pushing your win attempt through the interaction, through the pieces, through the other players at the table. So you go Thassa's Oracle, next player goes Counterspell, you Counterspell back, you won the game, you won through the interaction. You could also just brute force your way, where you go, here's win attempt number 1, Thassa's Oracle, they go Counterspell, you go, okay, here's win attempt number 2, Underworld Breach, and they can't stop the second one, right? So it's winning through. And then there's winning in spite of, and that's there is interaction at the table that cannot be used, or players choose not to use it. And this one's got a little bit more finesse to it. Winning in spite of, a better example is like you cast Silence, and Silence either gets interacted with or it doesn't. But either way, it doesn't actually affect your win attempt. So when I go Silence and you go Fierce Guardianship, and then I go Thassa's Oracle Demcon, and Demcon can't be countered because the Fierce Guardianship is already spent. You didn't even interact with my win condition. I didn't win through anything. There was no interaction to be used there. We're winning in spite of that interaction. Or there is a Fierce Guardianship, and they never even have the opportunity to even cast the spell, because the first spell I cast is Grand Abolisher. Your non-creature counter doesn't answer that spell, so Grand Abolisher resolves, and now you're sitting there with the non-creature counter in your hand, unable to interact with the actual win condition itself. Basically, it's when a player tries to win, and the actual win condition itself cannot be interacted with. It's only the protection, or there's just not an ability for the table to try and stop it whatsoever. And then we see at this last piece here, there's a new type of window that has presented itself in the past probably year to 3, and it's getting more and more prevalent as we progress into this flash meta, but that's winning over. So someone puts a win on the stack, everyone goes fight, 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 and then the next person goes Born Upon a Wind, there's nothing left, and they go. You can also see this sort of as a win through or a win in spite of. It's kind of like the two put together, but it's a little bit different, because there are still wins on the stack that may or may not have actually successfully been stopped. And so it leads to this winning over, leads to this weird dynamic where you attempt the win, but if you don't succeed, you maybe just die anyways, right? And so if you're winning over, you end up having to really figure out this dynamic of, I'm casting my Born Upon a Wind. Oh, there was one counterspell left. They know that the table knows, they know that I win the game basically without contest if this Born resolves. Therefore, they have to counterspell it. But in counterspelling this, they are not counterspelling the Demcon or the Adnos or the Breach or whatever it is that's on the stack that kills me underneath this. So winning over is a weird, like, sort of glass cannon place to play. But it is another type of window that we see crop up more and more, and players use it really successfully, especially when it comes to the context of tournament CEDH and forcing draws and things like that. Being able to win over can sometimes become an interaction point where, all right, I'm going to put this Born on the stack, and if the Born resolves, I get to win the game. You have one counter spell, and now I'm forcing this position of king making that in tournament CEDH doesn't really exist, because then we default to a draw, right? So that's just something else to be aware of as we talk about windows, and we'll get into that further. There's also this little tip at the bottom here to say the power of patience, right? So when we're talking about windows, the most important thing that a player can do is just be patient. And not that they shouldn't try and win quickly, because certain decks just want to do that, right? We've seen our speed model in previous videos as well. That's coming up later in the video. We'll reference it as well. But the idea that your window there are fake windows, there are windows that present themselves that are closed very rapidly. It's not necessarily behooving of a player to force a window, right? To shoot where there isn't one, just knowing that they're going to get stopped. Instead, it's sometimes better, even for really fast decks like Rao or Tali or something like that, to just sit there and be patient and bide their time. And similarly for controlling mid-range decks, sometimes you hit those mid-game states where you're trying to win after, right? Someone's already shot a shot, but there's still interaction at the table, so this next attempt is going to get stuffed, and you don't actually want to be the person to push there. There's also merit in, of course, we've talked about in the speed video as well, in steps 1 and 2, we talked about sometimes it behooves us to play outside of our quote-unquote optimal windows or play patterns. And in this case, it means sometimes we actually check a win attempt out there. Our win attempt, we intend for it to get stopped. If it succeeds, great, but if it doesn't, we've also eaten some interaction out of the table in order to progress the game and maybe stop somebody else from winning through using their counterspell to back up their own win or something like that. Okay, so we're going to move into a couple of examples. We talked about Thassa's Oracle, and I think this is just a really good, concise way to talk about step number 1 of Windows winning under, right? So we have here turn 1, turn 2. On turn 1, the player, goes land Lotus Petal, and then on turn 2, Thassa's Oracle, immediately followed by a Demonic Consultation. We have all 3 of our pips right there. It's turn 2, especially if we're on the play and our opponents actually haven't had the chance to play a second mana source in a lot of cases, or if they tapped out for an early Mystic Remora, or the green player played a Dork instead of holding up Swan Song using their Tropical Island, then this win under example really pops up, right? And so it says, the note is that your opponents don't have the ability to cast interaction, and it's not free, right? So frequently we see winning under happening. Maybe people are dying with counterspells in their hand, but it's just they actually couldn't cast them, which means that they effectively didn't have the counterspell, right? Like if we tap Trop and play Birds of Paradise, we don't have Swan Song up on turn 2, which means that when the seat 1 goes Oracle Consult, we just explode. There's nothing we can do about it. Example 2 for winning after, we're going to sort of iterate on these as much as possible to make it concise, right? So example 2, we're going to take the same situation. The player 1 goes land Lotus Petal, and then land Oracle Consult, and then there's an additional thing that happens in this interaction is that one of your opponents has the ability to cast interaction, or they have like Force of Will or something. So they hit you with the Force of Will on your Consult, and you fail to win the game. You pass the turn. The next player untaps and is able to go. They went like land Ancient Tomb, 2-mana Rock, Mana Vault, and now they're going land Ad Nauseam or something, right? And now they're casting the Ad Naus. The only castable interaction at the table was this Force of Will, and it was used to stop the table from dying to Thassa's Oracle because it was presented first, which means this win that is presented second, being Ad Nauseam in this case, succeeds, right? Now for example 3, which is winning through, we have the land Lotus Petal Oracle example. The opponent has castable interaction. They stop us, and then the second opponent casts Ad Nauseam, and another opponent has free or castable interaction. They go cast Ad Nauseam, we go cast Counterspell, and then the Ad Nauseam player counterspells back, and they successfully win through the interaction, right? So if they have a Robek on the battlefield and their Fierce Guardianship's up, they go cast the turn 2 Ad Naus. After the Oracle combo is stopped with a Force, the Force is sent and then responded to with a Fierce Guardianship. The Ad Nauseam player proceeds to go and win the game. So now we move to example 4, winning in spite of. This is an opponent holding a known Swan Song. And this is where things start to get a little bit trickier, right? So opponent is holding a Swan Song. We know about it. Swan Song does not hit Abolisher. We're going to cast Grand Abolisher. Grand Abolisher resolves because it cannot be counterspelled by the Swan Song. We then resolve Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation, and the Swan Song doesn't do anything because they can't cast a spell. We can also expand upon this example to show that Silence achieves the same effect, where we cast Silence. The Swan Song is cast on Silence because obviously your opponents cannot allow that to resolve. And then you Oracle Consults, and the Swan Song is once again effectively rendered useless, even though it was spent, because it was not cast on something meaningful, right? And then now we hit example 5, which is winning in spite of. This is an expansion upon that, right? So an opponent's going to, they have the Swan Song. We cast Thassa's Oracle Demcon, and the opponent uses their Swan Song to counter the Consult. We have extra mana, so we cast Tainted Pact in response to the Oracle trigger still. and this falls through, and we win the game because the consult was countered, but the tainted pact, which achieves the same effect, resolves. We exile our library. Oracle trigger resolves. We win the game. 2 attempts, 1 counter spell. We get there, right? That is winning in spite of the interaction. And then we move to this Born Upon a Wind example at the end here, which is Thassa's Oracle Demcon. Same examples again. Opponent's going to use their Swan Song to counter the consult. The Tainted Pact is going to be cast in response to the Oracle trigger. In response to this Tainted Pact, the opponent is going to cast Born Upon a Wind, and then this leads to Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation from the opponent who cast Born Upon a Wind. There was only the 1 counter spell. Tainted Pact, which is lethal for them, is on the stack, but we do not successfully win the game because our opponents executed the exact same combo over the top of us, right? And this is a great example of how draws can be forced if there was 1 extra counter spell available, or even just the risk of if I have 1 extra counter spell, right? I can go ahead and cast Born Upon a Wind, and maybe it even succeeds. But then if our opponent's consult goes onto the stack and I can counterspell back again, then I'm just stopping their win attempt and mine's going through anyways, right? So all these different ways of presenting wins at various means of various dynamics of the table interacting with you. Okay, so like I told you, we were going to revisit this model about speed, and here it is. So once again, this is the step 1-2 model. Fast decks are attempting to win the game rapidly before cycling into a don't lose the game mode. Slow decks are attempting to not lose the game before cycling into attempt to win the game mode, right? So when we're talking about windows and the way that decks are built to take advantage of them, certain lists like Ral and Atali are just great examples that just exist off the top of my head. Rogsai falls into this category too frequently, is that they're built to try and win under. They generate absurd amounts of mana very, very rapidly, but they're kind of fragile, right? They fall apart if they're interacted with properly, if they have to mulligan too low, if they get a little bit unlucky on their flips if they're playing the dinosaur, right? These decks are trying to push through quickly their attempt that they consistently have access to, whether it's the ability to tutor early and make a lot of mana in Rogsai, or just resolve their commander after counting to 7, like Itali, or if it's just turn 1, resolve a Ral, turn 2, start storming. These are all ways that they're trying to win the game, but these decks tend to struggle as the games go on. And it's important to note the reason for this, right? Is the decks, because they're so focused on generating mana, generating card advantage, things like this quickly, the payoffs that they have are maybe many, but they tend to be more expensive, and so they have to ritual into it, right? Casting a Mana Vault or a Dark Ritual or a Heretic Ritual or something like that is a lot more challenging. Once your first attempt gets stopped, it's a lot more challenging to get back and present again because your mana is temporary. And as we know from looking at different decks across the spectrum, decks need basically one of 2 things to win the game, and both things will frequently result in just snowballing wins, right? And those are, decks need either mana advantage or card advantage. They need to either be able to generate a lot of cards to find rituals and whatnot, and then they can win with very little mana on the battlefield, or they need to be able to generate a lot of mana quickly in order to cast 1 or 2 specific cards in their hand in order to then present a win or create some snowballing effect, the advantage of which is insurmountable for the opponents. So decks are constructed based upon this spectrum of step 1, win the game, step 1, don't lose the game, step 2, win the game, and their relation to this slow, fast cycle, they're built to take advantage of certain windows. So, for example, Ral is going to try and win early. It's going to try and win under. It's going to maybe be able to try and win second if somebody jams before them and eats the 1 piece of interaction at the table. Like Rogsai chucks out Nadnaz on 1 or 2, or Itali chucks a Dino out on turn 1, eats a Mindbreak Trap, eats a Force of Will. Well, now Ral is going to resolve, and their stuff is going to resolve, and they're going to be able to keep trying to push advantage, right? The slower a deck is, the later in the game the deck is trying to take advantage of windows, typically, right? So if we look at something like Rog Thras, that deck is usually trying to, maybe it's trying to present first, and if that's the case, it's frequently trying to win through interaction because it's just making a bunch of mana and just chucking stuff onto the stack and just pushing through, right? The other piece of that would be like a Marnius or a Sisay or a Kinnan or something like that. They're frequently trying to win second. They're letting somebody else go first, drawing cards, making mana, firing a counterspell, collaborating with the table, stopping that attempt, and then post that, they're going to try and take advantage of this gap in available resources, whether it's mana or counterspells or silences or something like that, to try and jam, right? I think another good example in this case is like Timna Dargo. That deck is really, really good at winning in spite of. A lot of they're playing Mardu, which frequently reads as like Breach and Advos and stuff, and certainly they're on those cards. But the deck plays so many silence effects, whether they're creatures or just straight up silences to invalidate multiple spells. And a lot of their win cons actually are creature-based, being combos with Dargo, or come out of the graveyard, in the case of comboing with Ruthless Technomancer. The ability for opponents to interact with the deck is extremely limited, so it's going to frequently win in spite of whatever counterspell happens to be available. It doesn't matter that your opponents are drawing 22 cards off the Ristic Study. If they don't have exactly Silence, or exactly the correct removal spell at the correct time, exactly the correct counterspell at the correct time, being like frequently a creature counterspell, or a Mindbreak Trap to eat some linchpin piece that the deck is putting on the stack, there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for more control style decks to try and exploit that, right? And so even if these decks are trying to win really quickly, they get stopped, they will potentially have the opportunity to win later if they're willing to, like we talked about earlier, take some time, take a breath, exhibit a little bit of patience and impulse control to try and find a second window, right? If you can identify, doesn't matter that you got shut out early. If you've been shut out early, a lot of times the focus of the game sort of pivots off you to other players who are doing other things, who are much closer to winning the game by attempting to win second, right? And so because of that, there's this sort of like dead space where fast decks sometimes get to rebuy, even if it's just with a draw for turn every turn. They get extra turn equity, which can convert into a win attempt later, after somebody else attempts the third win or something like that. Or they can fish for something that allows them to win over, right? Rogsly trying to find their Born Upon a Wind or something like that. Or maybe Timna Dargo sits on Final Fortune and just sits there and wait until there's a massive stack war, and then at the end of all that, the player moves their end step, and we just insert ourselves right in between players 3 and 4 and get to take an extra turn, and now all the interaction's spent, the Final Fortune resolves and we get to shoot, right? And it doesn't matter that it's our last turn because this is supposed to be the last turn for the entire table. So it's just being patient, making sure that we are aware of the various different ways that our deck can exploit windows, right? It can be with activated abilities. If you're playing a Sisay or something, you can try and win over. You don't necessarily need a flash enabler. Sisay kind of is that. And then, of course, there's political engagements. We can talk to our opponents. We can enter into these deals and things like that. And in the process of entering into these deals and negotiating various, can I resolve this? Is this too far? Please don't counter my X because Y type of scenarios, we can sort of gain insight on the pieces that the table has available. And through that, it is very, very reasonable for a skilled player to be able to identify what types of interaction are available, what sort of windows are going to work at this table, based work against these players. Maybe this player's always holding up a counterspell every single turn, and we just know it, right? Like they've showed it to us, they're permitting us to resolve a piece one at a time here and there, but no one can jam because no one else has the requisite backup for it. we have to wait or try and force something where someone else is going to push a win attempt in order to then create an opportunity for us to fire a Born and go over the top. Or we have to sit there and try and draw cards somehow to find a way to beat, at minimum, one counterspell, most likely two, or win in spite of it, right? Maybe it's a force of will, and the only thing we can do is try and resolve our Sisei, and then just slowly, turn after turn, ramp up her power. And there's no removal at the table in this scenario, so we're winning in spite of the force of will because it didn't force our Sisei because it didn't kill them right away, right? So it's a little bit slower, but we'll get there eventually. And then, of course, I skipped over this one, but the best decks in the format, really at any given point, are going to be the decks that are able to take advantage of multiple windows consistently and on demand. So looking at this step 1 and 2 graph with the slow to fast rotations, we talked about how Kinnan and Blue Farm or Rog Thras, like the 3 big decks of the format, are so effective. It's because all 3 of them are able to take advantage of multiple windows as they're presented. All 3 of these decks are able to easily present wins on turn 2 or 3, given the right hand and the circumstances, or they can force their way through interaction because of counter spells, or just sheer density of spells put onto the stack, or they have silence effects, or their combos are creature-based and they're just really difficult to interact with, or their spells are uncounterable, or this, right? They have the ability to go flash speed, they have the ability to sort of just ignore certain pieces, because of Cavern of Souls Grand Abolisher, because Hullbreaker Horror is uncounterable, because we are casting Nature's Rhythm, getting it countered, casting it again from the graveyard, it gets countered, and then we're still just casting another tutor for a Boreal Breeze Caller, or we're just casting a Boreal Breeze Caller, or we're just untapping Cradle and spinning Thrasios more and more and more, right? And so we're just finding these points where we can just chuck so many things onto the stack all at one time that it exhausts the table and they can't really do anything about it. Okay, so this slide here is talking about sort of an exercise that you can do when you're playing practice games in CEDH, trying to get ready for a tournament or something like that. This is an exercise you can do in order to try and develop that sense of patience, that ability, sixth sense to identify when is the correct time to go for it, when is it not the correct time to go for it. So I do recommend, I do this myself sometimes, is that you have a win attempt in your hand, but don't cast it. You've set a time limit with friends, playing on a timer, got 80 minutes, 100 minutes, 90 minutes, whatever it happens to be, right? You're playing for a set amount of time. At the end of that time limit, either it's a draw or someone has to go, so you're packing it up. Just don't try and win the game. Identify when you think you could, and then just hold on to it. Just hold on to it, especially if you're playing Turbo, especially if you think that you just consistently get shoved early in the face of interaction that you didn't know existed. Just sit and hang out and wait. And yeah, it's going to suck. It's going to feel kind of bad, but it does help you develop an important skill, and that is just recognizing that sometimes it's okay to just hang out and let other people try to win first. Even if your deck is designed to go fast, sometimes it is more effective for you to try and win second. Or in this case, based on this exercise, you're going to try and win not at all. It's literally an impulse control exercise. You can also flip this on its head if you find that you're just frequently having difficulty closing a game because you're always waiting till the last second, and then either everyone has infinite resources and the game bogs and no one wants to play anymore, you all just go home, or if you do play on a timer with your friends, then you reach the time limit and it's a draw. You can flip this exercise on its head as well, and you can say, okay, first chance I see to try and win the game, I'm casting my spells to win the game. Even if that's not really what my personal play style is, that's not really the way that I want to play the game, doing this will force you to develop habits. It will force you to sort of like put yourself in this situation where you're casting your spell and it's getting countered. And yeah, it feels bad, but a lot of times the reason that players avoid trying to win the game and end up in these bogged game states where they can't really do anything practically to win the game is because they're so cautious just by nature that they're so scared of their spell getting countered, they refuse to put it on the stack. And you'll never know whether or not your opponents actually have the counter spell or not at the end of the day until after you put your spell on the stack. and you pass priority on it, and it gets counted, right? So especially for the cautious players, flip this exercise on its head and just say, yeah, I have turn 2 Thassa's Oracle. I know this is getting Mind Break trapped or Flusterstormed or mental missteps or whatever, and just do it anyways. It's a casual game. You have nothing left to lose. And what this will do is it's sort of like the trust fall exercise, right? Where you realize that there's really like no downside to attempting to win the game. We can talk about the tournament math or whatever and how it's advantageous or not advantageous and whatnot all day. But at the end of the day, you're playing a game, and this isn't going to physically hurt you in any way to attempt to win the game and then get blown out, right? So it's important to have that skill set to just present as well as to have that skill set to just sit back, hang out, not get in the way of other people running themselves into the ground, and then go second, go third, right? Okay, now we're gonna move on to talking about sort of the specific elements of Windows. So I think that this is a really this is a more advanced approach to looking at how Windows present themselves in games. And I got these graphs on the side that are probably gonna be a little intimidating for some. But before we get into that, I actually can't take full credit for these concepts that I'm elaborating on. They are my concepts. I am the person who wrote them out in this particular way and is elaborating on these. But the idea of Windows being malleable, recurrent, and temporal has existed for a long time. If you dig into the YouTube archives, you can find videos from CEDH TV, Rebel, various other content creators in the past who have talked about these concepts, sort of. I think Play to Win has a video on something similar as well, if you dig way back, right, years ago. But do you think fundamentals are important? And what we are doing with this sort of curriculum in this series is we're developing fundamentals for players to be able to look at and have the terminology to talk about these things. And then we can build upon that to reach loftier concepts and improve everyone's gameplay overall, right? So if we're talking about Windows specifically, I've broken them out into 3 characteristics that exist for Windows. Windows are malleable, they are recurrent, and they are temporal. And what I mean by this, we'll get into each one of these specifically in another slide. But basically what I mean is that malleability means Windows can shift from one place to another. They can be moved around by players, their deck construction, their game actions, etc. Right? They are recurrent, meaning that there is almost never going to be a situation in which there is only one window for your deck. I'm not saying it's impossible for that to happen, but I am saying that will almost never occur. So it's really worth looking at Windows instead of this is open, it's closed, and I've lost the game, is this window's open, it has closed, where is my next one? Because it will occur again. And then windows are temporal, meaning that they are going to occur across certain points of the game more or less frequently based upon how that flow is going. And that one's a little bit more abstract, but we'll get into it on the slide. I do want to break down these graphs on the side real quick. I snagged 3 really good decks that all have different characteristic spreads of these and sort of how I envision these decks with these characteristics, right? So we'll take the top one, Blue Farm, on a scale of 1 to 5, or 0 to 5, I guess, where 0 is the deck has no characteristics, meaning that it doesn't exist. Decks shouldn't really have a 0 in this category. It should always fall at minimum like a 1 or something, right? But Blue Farm, we're going to say that this deck's ability to find windows, the malleability factor is probably about a 4, meaning it's higher than average. The player who is piloting Blue Farm has the ability to sort of push around their window because they have so much interaction. They have a lot of different ways to capitalize, be it Cavern Grand Demolisher, Silences, Born Upon a Winds, Final Fortunes. They have a lot of redundancy. Card draw gives you options, things like that. They have an insane amount of recurrence, right? It's also going to be on like a 4 there, just because the ability for them to go, here's my turn 1 Necropotence. Okay, it got stopped. Well, I guess I'm going to pivot to a Timno or a Ristic Study and try again for a window later is very, very high. They have a lot of ability to just go, get stopped, and try again, right? And then their temporal relation, the deck's ability to succeed over a given length of time, meaning basically the longer the game goes, the ability, how to say this, the longer the game goes, the deck will be able to present consistently, and it will have some degree of inevitability the longer the game goes. It's pretty reasonable, right? It's decidedly average at worst, maybe a little bit better than average on best. I scored it at a 3 because I don't really think it's 4 as far as terms of attrition and inevitability go. I think that there are other decks that just do that better. But they do draw a lot of cards, they have a lot of interaction. So in an untimed round, they'll probably be one of the better suited decks to try and push into the later game consistently. If we look at Kinnan, they sort of flip. We see that their malleability shoots up to a 5. They have a lot of ability to push around windows for maybe not themselves so much, though they can, because they accelerate their mana base incredibly rapidly, but also because of the insane amount of interaction that the deck plays. I'm assuming a no bad cards variant, sort of like the Freedom Waffle version of this deck for this example. They have the ability to push other people's windows around, opening them and closing them sort of, not necessarily on command, but very, very consistently, very, very reliably. And so because of that, the malleability factor goes up. Not necessarily their ability to open their own windows by force, but they can close other people's really, really well. And then when they have what they need, they can forcibly keep their own windows open longer than necessarily should be, right? And that moves into their higher temporal relation score, which is going to be on a 3, because as long as the game goes, I think it's a 3. Yeah, that's a 4, my bad. The malleability to temporal relation is going to be a 4 because they make so much mana so rapidly. They have a 1-card win condition. They play so many card advantage engines. Their ability to sustain the consistent counter spells and stack wars is very, very high. It's actually better than blue farms when you look at it. Consistently, the NBC Kinnan list locks cards into a stack, and it keeps them there. It exhausts counter spells, draws cards, endurances itself, putting counter spells back into the deck, allowing it to keep going even after it's drawn its deck. It can cycle through its deck multiple times, right? And so because of that, temporal relation is a little higher than blue farms, though its recurrence is going to be a little bit lower, right? Its recurrence is at about a 2 here, based on the fact that you present your basalt monolith, it gets stopped. It's kind of iffy. You're now pushed back into this grind position, right? You're presenting your Hullbreaker Horror now. Okay, well, if that gets Mindbreak trapped off the stack, that's not great for us either. Okay, now we have to find another type of alternative win condition. And so because of that, the ability of the deck to try and recur its wins, thus the recurrence factor, is going to be lower by some margin than blue farms, because we're not going to be able to push early and then push mid and then push late. We're going to push early, maybe, push mid, maybe, and then push late. Right, and so it's gonna scale based upon your pod and how much you have to use your resources to open and shut windows for other people, right? And then lastly, we have this Timna Dargo, which probably a top 5 deck in the format, but the real reason I selected it is that it's just so different from the other decks in terms of characteristics. This deck doesn't have a lot of malleability. It's like decidedly average. They play silences. They play like a Red Blast or a Redirect Lightning or something here and there, right? So they have the ability to try and open their own windows, Final Fortunes and whatnot, but they aren't really closing other people's windows either. So it's about average, net neutral across the board there. But their temporal relation is going to be similar to that. They have pretty solid early game push, right? So strong early game push. They're going to hit the mid game, have a really solid mid game, and the longer the game drags after that, it's your ability to sort of force through wins. You're going to exhaust your resources, and even though you have a Timna, your life total runs out, or someone snipes your Dargo and blows up your board or something, and now you've already exhausted your rituals and your artifacts and whatnot. So you don't really have a ton, not that it doesn't exist, right? But once again, it's decidedly average. You don't have a ton of ways to push through into the late game. But the recurrence of this deck is actually insane, right? The ability for this deck to go, all right, I have identified that this is the window I have. Cast Silence, gets Counterspell. Okay. Cast my spell, gets Counterspell. Okay. Followed up with Cast Dargo. Dargo resolves. Sacrifice Dargo to a ritual. Make mana. That resolves. Okay. Cast another Win Attempt. That gets countered. Okay. I have an absurd amount of mana. Cast another Win Attempt. That gets countered. Okay. Cast another Win Attempt. Right? And you just keep pushing through it is actually ridiculous. And especially in those mid-game turns, right? Where you are able to draw 2 extra cards with Tymna, push really hard, exhaust the table's resources, make it around again, draw 2 more cards with Tymna, push really hard again, just literally the turn after. You're presenting turn after turn after turn, and your top decks are so frequently live to just kill the table. It's insane. If you have not seen this deck's ability to just go, you don't have silence? Great, I'm going. Okay, you found silence on first study? I'm going again next turn, so it doesn't really matter. Is quite ridiculous. We have a really, really great Tymna Dargo player in the area here, and just every time I see the deck do its thing, I'm just blown away. Like, you have to shut this deck down early, or it just keeps chugging along, right? So that's sort of like the idea there with like recurrence being off the charts for Tymna Dargo. But all that to say is you'll notice that all 3 of these decks, being like top 5 decks or whatever, they're very well balanced in their character traits. Tymna Dargo has 3/3/5. Blue Farm has 4/3/4, and then Kinnan has a 5/4/2, which that 2 is a little bit out of place compared to the other 2, but because it has a 4 and a 5 in the other category, while the other decks don't have a 4 and a 5 in the other categories, that kind of makes up for it, right? It's still, the averages are all sitting about the same, which is just a little bit, it's basically more or less around 4 for all of these, right? And that designates sort of why these decks are so good, is their traits are so balanced and complement one another so well within the deck and the shell and the game plans they're trying to execute. Okay, so like I said, we're going to talk about specifically what malleability of windows looks like here. My bullet points on this are going to be that deck construction affords players the agency to sort of determine when their windows are going to be, just that rip. If you look, we call it in a vacuum, right? So in a vacuum, Rao's deck construction, Itali's deck construction affords players the agency to consistently try and win under, right? Consistently gets opportunities presented early to try and force something through. If we look at something like CEDH in a vacuum, the deck consistently sees opportunities to win after or win on top of, because all they have to do is resolve their guy, get some powers on her, and then activate her to try and win the game in some variety of manner, right? The deck construction in a vacuum designates how your deck manipulates windows. Deck construction, as far as card selection goes, kind of it reads towards how you are able to manipulate the windows of others. So in this case, decks that play counter spells are going to have the ability to close the windows of other decks faster than, say, a deck that doesn't play a counter spell or a silence, right? Because these cards that allow us to interact with our opponents on the stack, we can close their windows by virtue of, hey, your win attempt is stopped here. Silence in response to your breach, counterspell your Thassa's Oracle, endurance you, right? But with that said, types of interaction that do not counter spells or stop spell casting may or may not have more or less effectiveness against other types of decks. So if we think about, like, CEDH doesn't necessarily care about being silenced. It's hard to counterspell a lot of their things, especially when they're just dumping stuff onto the battlefield. But if you're playing, say, white, and you have a Path to Exile in your deck, you can path your opponent's CEDH or their legend or something to manipulate the activation. You can sort of close that window on what they were trying to do. If they're trying to get to Drevi and you exile their Lotho, which is their only other legend in response, CEDH's power suddenly becomes 2 over the top of her activation, and now she can only get a 1 cost, right? So that's how you can manipulate the ability of other players to win the game. Ramp stacks protection interaction. So talking about our deck construction once again, if we build in more ramp, more rituals, this accelerates our ability to play our own game plan, which thus increases our agency when it comes to setting whatever window we want to make. Stacks, kind of the flip of that, right? If you are playing a null rod on turn 1 off your Ancient Tomb, and your opponents have all ramped out like crazy with their Soul Rings and their Chrome Mox and whatever, then this null rod has shut a lot of your opponent's abilities to just try and win the game early, because they now have to remove this or find other ways to generate mana. The stacks here, the stacks pieces, are shutting other players' windows. You are able to manipulate the abilities of other decks to win the game based upon inclusion of your cards. Same thing with if someone is bouncing your Corvold and you Veil of Summer in response, the Veil of Summer protects your Corvold, which expands your window. You can continue to try and push this turn, or even if, say, it took the last of your mana, the fact that you don't have to redeploy Corvold next turn, maybe you don't even have the mana to do that, it expands your ability to try and win the game because your engine, your combo piece is still on the battlefield, right? And interaction with counterspells and silences we kind of talked about just a second ago sort of speaks for itself. And then resources available sort of plays into that ramp and stacks piece, where if you can control what your opponents have and how many toys they have to play with, you sort of can frequently, barring, of course, like a God tier top deck or something, that's always the caveat of all these discussions, is that you can control what they're able to do more or less, right? Like if you are Orcish Bowmastering Rogthrast's battlefield, you are controlling the amount of mana they have available to them directly. And so because of that, you are able to control sort of what they're able to do in terms of winning the game, whether it's an Oboro Breezecaller combo or a Cloud of Fairies like iteration or something like that, right? And similarly, if you slow play into a Rhystic Study, if let's say Blue Farm goes to, let's say Rogshy, right? Rogshy is the new hotness right now. Deck mulls to 5, casts turn 1, turn 2 Rhystic Study. The rest of the table agrees to just sort of like chill out, play a land, play a dork, pay for the Rhystic Study, play this thing, pay for the Rhystic Study, play their own Rhystic Study and not pay, but that's only one card, and now there's another Rhystic Study, and we can sort of check resources against each other. The idea of maintaining table parity here, that's gonna really help the rest of the table control what Rogshy is going to be able to do. Because if we just feed them 37 cards, then we're dead. But if they mulled low and they played this Rhystic Study and it's supposed to get them back in the game, if we don't give them extra cards, or as few extra cards as possible, while still trying to advance our own game plans, then they can't really do a ton. It's really not that detrimental of a resource to have them drawing one card every third spell let's cast, right? Like, that is not a good rate. that's effectively just casting a Phyrexian Arena that doesn't actually tax their life total. They're drawing one extra card every rotation, more or less. And so because of that, manipulating your opponent's resources allows you to expand your own windows and close theirs, or like sort of like invert that and say, I'm closing your ability to close a window, right? If this deck is supposed to be counterspelling things on the stack, and we're saying you can't draw cards, you can't make mana, you can't do any of these things, they're not really going to have the ability to stop you when the time comes for you to say, here's a Thassa's Oracle, pay for Rhystic Study. Here's a Demcon, pay for Rhystic Study. You have no counterspell because everyone has paid for all the resources, including these. That's really unfortunate. Guess I win the game. So just being aware of that and those resources available, right? Window recurrence. This is, I think, it's like kind of intuitive, but a lot of players don't really, I think they struggle with this idea, especially when they're playing faster decks. Oh, sorry, one extra note here. I'm gonna slide back one slide. On this resource note, I did want to say, in the vein of table parity, which maybe we'll talk about at a later video here, this is a hard thing for fast decks to grasp, and we're going to sort of scale that into the next one here. But table parity does not really benefit fast decks in a lot of ways. So sometimes it is better for those decks that just take the gamble and gamble on the fact that if this deck has no mana available, their counterspell isn't going to work, because in general, aggressive fast decks tend to disbalanced table parity tends to favor those decks. When the control player has no cards or no mana, or the mid-range player has no engine or threat or something like that, those games tend to go towards turbo decks because they're able to just push out of nowhere from hand very rapidly and generate absurd amounts of resources very quickly, which moves into this window recurrence. Because these fast decks tend to lean into the idea that disbalanced tables favor them, which tends to be true, they sometimes have difficulty identifying that they should not disbalance the table on purpose, right? And this goes back into that identifying our windows thing, where win first, win second, win through, etc. If the fast deck tries to win first, but there is something to stop them, the player with the Risk of Study who's tapped out on turn 2 will frequently untap and win anyways, or push so far ahead they cannot be stopped, because they've generated so many resources, because we did not control their resources and what was available to them, and we did not use our control over their game plan to malleably shrink the window, right? In this case, turbo decks might sometimes find it to their advantage to identify that it is better to push second, and they sort of fall into this role of a control player or whatever. They're just counterspelling the things that stop them directly and that win the game directly for other players, trying to get somebody else to push just a little too far and disbalance the table for them. And this is okay because of window recurrence. If your deck is built to win under, that does not mean that you cannot win after, or you cannot win over. It just means that your deck is skewed a certain way, and it might be a little more difficult for you to recognize these secondary or tertiary types of windows. Because you can still find these windows, if you are alive, if your life total has not hit 0, if another player has not comboed and kill you, you can still find a window. And to this end, sometimes it benefits the Ral player or the Atali player to just chill and not get in the way of the control player who's beating up the mid-range player who's trying to do their cradle shenanigans to win the game. And the turbo player gets to, kind of for free more or less, cast 7 spells into the control player's Rhystic Study or the mid-range player's Rhystic Study or whatever to trigger the Orcish Bowmasters or the Smothering Tithe or something, so that they can stop the mid-range player. And because of that, that turbo player spells kind of just resolve, right? They get to cast a Demonic Tutor and not pay and not really care. They get to resolve, you negotiate with the table and you resolve a Mnemonic Betrayal for this Mystic Remora and 3 rocks and not pay for Rhystic Study and not get Endurance or Silence or Counterspell or something like that, because we're using our resources to beat up on this other person because that person has disbalanced the table. And because that person has disbalanced the table, we, the turbo player, now get to take advantage of that opportunity and try and create extra resources for ourselves by feeding other resources to another player, which will then allow us to try and win in this disbalanced state after, when it gets back to our turn, after this mid-range player gets stopped, or over the top or something like that. Because when all these resources are expended on player X mid-range guy over here, we now don't have to face the Force of Will and the Swan Song and the Mindbreak Trap. Those are all gone. And the mid-range players, Flusterstorm, Silence, and Grand Demolisher have all been dealt with. So now we kind of just get to do like whatever we want to on our turn and play around much fewer options from our opponents, right? And so these attributes, these concepts of window recurrence can be sort of like broken down further and consolidated into resilience, redundancy, and attrition, meaning the ability for the deck to come back from being stopped, the ability for the deck to push again and push again, and then attrition is a tertiary game state where you're not playing early game, you're not playing late game, you're not playing mid game, right? But it's after all these resources have been exhausted. It is a state wherein the counter spells have all been spent. Everyone is tapped out. All of these things have already been done. I'm going to try and win. It's kind of like you almost come full circle in attrition states where you just get to win for free because all the interaction that's available to the table has been spent. You've kind of come back to square one where you're kind of, it's like turn 17, but you're winning under air quotes because no one has the ability to interact with you, right? Like it's all just been spent. No one has a counterspell available. They could be drawing 12 cards off their Mystic Remora off your Storm turn, but every counterspell in their deck is in their graveyard, so it doesn't matter. And that is sort of what attrition state is. And that's the kind of game state that we see control decks try and push into, is they don't necessarily need a Grand Abolisher or a protection piece because their attrition game plan is so good. Whereas redundancy and resilience are characteristics that we tend to see more in turbo decks and mid-range decks, where if your turbo deck is resilient, that means you push, get stopped, wait a couple turns, push again, right? You're coming back. You have a secondary game plan. The redundancy is I have multiple opportunities to use different cards to execute the same combo, which is like very key to Dargo, right? And that's sort of like that ability of Dargo decks to go, here's a thing, stop me, okay, I'm gonna do it anyways. Stop me again, okay, I'm gonna do this other thing anyways, to combo again and again and again using Dargo, right? And then this last one here is the temporal nature of windows, and that will sort of wrap up our lecture today. So the temporal nature of windows, like we had said, it relates to clock, so round timer relates to how much life you have left on your side of the table. You start at 40. If it's 0, you're dead. You can't win the game. But if you still have 1 life, you still potentially have a chance to win the game, even if your options are shrinking because there is an Orcish Bowmasters that you have to play around or something. The relational nature to a clock means that whether you get to a late game state and a draw based on time, or because you are playing Corvold in the command zone and he becomes a 12/12 2 turns after you cast him and just 2-shot somebody to commander damage, that relates to time, right? If I'm punched by Corvold and he's a 12/12 and that player wants me dead and I can't make a flying block or I can't find a removal spell, I have very limited time to try and either win the game or answer this threat, right? That Corvold is a clock. Whether it's just for me personally or for the entire table, there is a clock on my game plan right now. And because of that, I have to be very careful and aware. And certain decks are a lot better at establishing clocks or playing on longer clocks as the game extends. Sisay, Marnius are examples of decks that do really, really well into long games. Something like Itali is something that does not typically do well into a long game. Your long-term game plan, your clock that you establish is flip Itali, I have no cards in my hand, maybe I can get 11 infect, 10 infect on somebody in order to delete a player, just balance the table and try and go again, right? And so we see at this little bar at the bottom here, game start, win attempt number 1, gets stopped, the game plays, win attempt number 2, game plays, and then you reach this attrition state like we talked about just a second ago, where everything is exhausted. And so that's like, in short, that's kind of like the lifespan of a game as it relates to a clock, right? You have this clock before everyone runs out of resources available. Everyone runs out of counter spells to cast, of win conditions to try and make, unless you have like a 5/5 in the command zone or something like that. Then that gives you an extra clock that you might have access to that other players don't, right? This idea of temporal nature of windows, meaning that we can just keep extending until we find another one because everyone's exhausted themselves or somebody dies or something, like you can close somebody's window by just killing them to life total. That is something that Kinnan does really well, not necessarily with the life total piece, but that is one of the reasons that that deck has such an extreme score in temporal relation, is because I cast all my counter spells and endurance myself again. All my counter spells are back. I can continue to draw counter spells, continue to protect my win attempt, continue to shut you out after I've already exhausted every counter spell in my deck, right? And that is sort of the idea of temporal nature. I keep saying life totals and going back to it, but it's just because I think it's a really underutilized area where CEDH players don't really see life totals as real in general. The Northwest is a little bit different, and we tend to pressure people's life totals when possible. Actually, one of the things you'll frequently see players do in this area is resolve like a Bowmasters into 2 or 3 Ristic Studies. And yeah, there'll be times where you're mowing down the Rogcross's board because you have to in order to not die. You're manipulating their window. But there are also times where you are using this Bowmaster to manipulate other people's windows. They draw a card, they get shot for 1. And so I've used this tactic too as a political tool. It's like, You guys don't need to shoot my Bowmasters here because I don't really feel the need. Like, there's nothing on the battlefield worth trimming right now. Game state's relatively balanced. But if you draw a card, I'm shooting you for 1. And players are generally okay with that because they don't see life totals as a real clock. But they are. They really are. If that hits 0, you're dead. And at a certain point, you have to start trading down on resources to block the Orc army or to try and get rid of this Bowmasters that you didn't think was a problem when it was first resolving because your life total was 35. And that's 35 shots you can take. But you've drawn 12 cards and been hit twice for 4 because of the other player's Crom. So suddenly that 35 life is now 15. And if you keep drawing cards or don't trade down on a creature to block this 45 Orc army or something, like, you're in a really bad spot now, especially if your win conditions keep getting interacted with and you now are forced into a position where you have to draw a card to counter the spell that is countering your spell so you can try and win the game. That's another card drawn. That's another Orcish Bowmaster trigger. You just lost another life point. Your clock just decreased by 1 tick out of 15. You now only have 14 ticks left on your clock. So you got to find out something else to do. And that's before the other player draws off their Rhystic Study off the counter spell that you just cast, which is another tick. And so for the 1 card you just drew and tried to stop your win attempt from getting interacted with, you just lost 2 ticks on your 15-point clock, meaning you're only at 13. That clock goes down way faster than you think it does. And it's like really, it can be really subtle, right? Fetch lands, pain lands, a ding from Timna here, I have nothing better to do, so I'm going to poke you with my bird token there. These things stack up, and especially when we reach these attrition states, that's where the temporal nature of decks really shows out, where when your deck is designed to play into and across a long game, that's where those decks succeed, and that's where a lot of other decks fall short. But all that to say, that's sort of all of the pieces left on the 3 characteristics of Windows. I don't have anything left to talk about in this particular video, so we're going to call it a wrap for today, and I'll see you all on the next one. Before I go, please don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe this channel and this video, and I will catch you on the next one.